First of all, excited to announce a person who I have watched on YouTube for quite a while. He does a bunch of things, but I'll let him talk about it. Welcome to the Better Than Peter podcast, Michael Rosmer.
Well, thank you for having me. It is a pleasure to be with you and your audience today. Thank you for the invite. So, for those who are not aware, I'm Michael. So, I have a YouTube channel called Offshore Citizen, where we have a business which is around that. We have a team who help people. And essentially, that particular thing, I do lots of different things, but that particular thing is really centered on helping people to either relocate or do business in multiple countries or to other countries. And so, we help you to figure out what is the best solution for you, whether that is where the best place is to relocate to, what the best visas are, what the best citizenships are, as well as what the best corporate structure is, as well as we're very jurisdiction agnostic. So what you'll find around a lot of the world is that people are in a particular country and they're sort of selling that country. Our philosophy is that diagnosis without or treatment without diagnosis is malpractice. And so it's really important to first identify what the person's situations are, what their goals are, and then based on that, choose whatever the best solution is for them, regardless of any biases that we might have or any places that we might have touched, but still bringing all the expertise of many years, I guess over a decade at this point in time, in living in other countries, doing business in other countries, having set up tons and tons of global structures, and probably pretty notably, something that gets overlooked a lot is banking in many different parts of the world because international banking is increasingly difficult. So, yeah, thank you for having me here.
Yeah, I knew I couldn't do this introduction, so that's why I left it over to you. And so again, we'll try to cover as much as we can, but for the purposes of this video, I'm going to tee it off by how I invited Michael on the show. So I saw one of his videos about why he left Canada. He keeps doing these periodic videos why he leaves a particular country, but in particular, why he left Canada. This seems to be a trending topic among even a lot of immigrants or new citizens. And again, it can be attributed to various things, the cost of living, the housing. This is a full video in itself. But Michael, specific to you, you seem to have left Canada a while ago, although you are back in the country at the moment. But
Yep.
why did you leave Canada specifically? And why do you think new immigrants or newer, people new to Canada are leaving?
So, I mean, my situation might be a little bit different than what a lot of new people are, and I'll talk maybe a bit to what some of my clients have said to be able to shed some light on that. But for myself, I think there was a combination of things. One was, so I'd lived before I would say I kind of permanently left Canada. I'd lived in a couple different countries for sort of part of the year, right? So, for example, I lived in Costa Rica half of the year for about 3 years. I'd lived in the US before. I'd done a fair amount of traveling, things like this. And when at the time when I kind of permanently left, there were a variety of reasons for that. One was just plain some business advantages. And some of those business advantages include lower costs. So I was able to hire people at more reasonable rates than what I could from the Canadian talent pool. Another was access to better legal systems, which were very particular to my business, right? So for a lot of people, you have to kind of pick and choose what's good for you. I think if you're in the film industry, you probably need to be in LA. If you're in the financial industry, good chance you're going to end up in New York or something, London, one of these kind of global financial hubs. For the type of business that I was doing at the time, there were some reasons to go to some other countries, and that was particularly useful. There was tax benefits, but I think the deeper underlying factor that would have caused me, regardless, to go was that Canada increasingly felt like a place that entrepreneurs and people who were successful were actually the enemy rather than the friend. And this is kind of ironic, given this is sort of the engine of growth, and we're supposed to praise the people who are starting small businesses and creating jobs and innovation and infrastructure and that sort of thing. But increasingly, I felt that that wasn't the case. Now, there because you'd have, for example, a lot of the people in, say, Vancouver would love to have expensive bags and drive Lamborghinis and all these sorts of things, but at the same time would criticize rich people. And so that was, I just, I didn't like the feeling of feeling like a bit of an enemy in my own country. It happened that something that was also useful was I ended up meeting the woman who became my wife. And so meeting her and, needing to find a place that we could both be for a period of a few years prior to getting married was really instrumental and important in that particular time, and also kind of where it is that we ended up. But I think overall it was kind of a combination of all those things
Yeah.
that went into sort of my particular situation. For other
Yeah,
people,
sorry to cut you off, but your wife is from which country?
Montenegro.
And I assume to try to get her to come to Canada would not be easy.
No, not easy.
Yeah.
Not easy. Yeah.
Oh,
Once you're married, it's a different thing. I mean, it still takes a bunch of time, but it's possible once you're married. But yeah, prior to that, quite difficult. Um, and so a factor that I guess plays in there a little bit, and I hear a lot from other people. So I've talked to, say, clients who are from India, and let's kind of keep the context in mind. For a lot of people in India, coming to Canada is like the holy grail. It is like the gold standard of what you want to do. And I've talked to clients who they're like, "Hey, we moved to Canada 4 years ago and we're leaving." And you're like, "Wow, that really says something, right? That this thing that was so prized that people work, frankly, like it's really hard. It's not easy to immigrate for most people. It takes a long time, a lot of effort, often a lot of money. It's displacing, etc. And they consider it was worthwhile. People come and now they're leaving. And what's going on there? And what they say to me is essentially three main things. They say, number one, the economic opportunities aren't the same as they were in the past. And I will say, I didn't realize how small-minded a lot of Canada was until I left Canada. So the mindset of what is possible, of what significant success means, etc., is simply much larger in some other parts of the world. Not all parts of the world, of course, but then you would get in the Canadian environment. So that's something. The second is that they said the cost of living has become ridiculous. Now, this is particularly the case, sort of, I don't know, post-COVID or COVID on. But frankly, it was going up for a long time before then. If you just think about the cost of housing in Vancouver and then later Toronto, I mean, it's pretty unaffordable. There's a great TikTok channel where this guy compares real European castles versus Canadian real estate and goes through and shows like, hey, you've got like this $2 million dilapidated, nothing on it, little house on this little lot in Toronto. And oh, here's this beautiful European castle that you can buy. Which one would you prefer? And it's quite a comical insight. The third is that healthcare sucks. And I find this quite interesting because a lot of people in certain areas will say, "Oh my gosh, if I leave the country, I'm losing my public health care," or, "Oh, you're paying taxes, but at least you get this free health care." You're like, "Well, hang on a minute. Let's try quantifying what that health care is actually worth." And I mean, there's different ways of doing that. One is to just look at percentage of GDP that is allocated to healthcare. So, it's approximately 10, 12% in most Western countries, a little bit more in the US, about 18%. But generally that. So you can kind of say, okay, well, essentially healthcare is worth, about a 10% tax. And is the rate of tax you're paying 10%? The answer is no, no, you're paying quite a bit more than that, especially once you add in consumption taxes, etc. So that's the first thing. The second is what can you replace it with in some of these other countries and at what quality? So my brother recently had to go and get a particular type of scan of his face and jaw, and it was like 6 months wait. And I think it was going to cost like 100 Canadian dollars even after using BC Healthcare to get this done. I was living in Dubai and said, okay, well, what would it be here in Dubai? The answer is I could go in tomorrow and get it done for 250 Canadian dollars. I'm like, I don't know.
you
It's
tell me, a
practical.
6 month wait or $150 more?
Exactly, exactly.
No.
And so I think that people are sometimes there's a little bit of fear that comes from the unknown without really having quantified what's going on when it comes to healthcare. The healthcare is really good in Malaysia. Healthcare is really good in a bunch of different parts of the world. And so you can always go to those places.
Yeah, no, Michael, I think you really covered the major points really well. I had seen the deterioration similar. I mean, I haven't been in Canada for a while, but you could see the writing on the wall. But post-COVID, it just seems to have accelerated. And then one more factor is the lack of jobs, or it just seems like even for a job working at, I almost said dépanneur, but almost working in your local grocery store or your Walmart, there's like 1,000 people for 5 positions, and it's gone beyond now. It's basically a ticking time bomb, and a lot of the so-called the Canadian dream is now become a Canadian nightmare. So thank you for going into detail, and I know that you've also covered different countries, but now I want to flip it and talk about a different topic. Let's say, where in the world, if you just had $1,000, would you be able to live? So let's say somebody's in Canada, he's a new graduate, disillusioned by the system, probably can make $1,000 online. If you were to advise him or her, where would you tell them that these are your top three options, keeping in mind, and I keep this in mind, you can easily spend $2,000 as well
Yep.
based on your living standard, or how you want to live in a particular country. But let's just start with a simple base of $1,000. If Michael Rosmer was, let's say, 24 years old and he knows what he knows today, which top three countries would he go to?
So let's just clarify that that's $1,000 a month, right?
Correct. Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, so look, like I don't think that the quality of life is amazing anywhere in the world for $1,000 a month. So can you survive? Yes, you can survive. Is it going to be great? It's probably not going to be wonderful. But places in the world that tend to have a good value for the money, I think would be, so certainly Malaysia. Malaysia, what you get for the money is perhaps unrivaled anywhere else in the world. A place that people wouldn't normally talk about, but actually the value for the money I think is quite good, would be Azerbaijan.
Mhm.
So um, you could certainly go to various areas in South America. Where I would go there specifically is probably a little bit more difficult to say. I guess that's partially personal preference. A lot of people would probably say someplace like Colombia would be like a nice balance of sort of lifestyle, accessibility, and costs. Although, again, I don't think that you're going to live like so. In general, you're probably not going to live exceptionally well on $1,000 a month, but that would be something.
Let me change it then. Let me make it $1,500, just to give
All
you
right,
the
sounds good.
nicer,
Yeah, yeah,
bigger apartments, and then so let's say
yeah,
$1,500 a month for a
yep,
single person, US
yep,
dollars. So that's probably 2 grand Canadian. So
yep,
where would your three picks be? Okay, let's go one with KL,
yep,
Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur.
yep.
Azerbaijan, I want to hear a little bit more, because I know the name, but I don't know anything beyond it. And they have an F1 over there.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so Baku is an extraordinarily wonderful city. It's something I find that when you travel around the world, you sort of get these sort of four categories of places that you can go to, right? The one are like dumps, and you kind of know they're a dump. Um, then there's places.
let's not name them, but yeah,
No, no.
yeah.
Yeah. Then there is places that they're like really good, but you kind of like that they're good, and usually they're fairly expensive, right? Not necessarily, but usually they're fairly expensive. But certainly there are places that you're like, okay, it's surprising that it's good. Um, Places that you think are good and turn out to be good, and so there's a few of those. And then there's places that are like hidden gems, right? The places that you don't expect anything and you show up and you're like, wow, this is awesome. And I find that Baku is such a place. So for people who haven't been there, it is kind of on the Caspian Sea in Central Asia, right next to Georgia, south of Russia. And it is a country that was one of the earlier ones to have discovered oil. So they've had oil for quite a long time. And when you visit Baku, it's basically like Dubai and Paris had a child. It's unbelievable in that regard. Now, it's difficult to get in and
I
out
have
of.
my headlines. So Dubai and Paris had a child. Baku
There
is
you
born. So that's a
go.
good
Perfect.
YouTube. Yeah, I've never heard a city be described that way. But it's been called a little bit like mini Dubai from people who I lived in Dubai and who went to
Yep.
Baku. Who, again, they said the highways, the malls. To your point, so that is an hidden gem.
Yep.
Give me one in South America if you can for $1,500,
Yeah,
and
I mean, I think
with
like you could live
security
pretty.
being good.
Security being good in in Latin America has like, that is always the question. I mean, I think that a lot of people, certainly a lot of my clients, just from like a lifestyle standpoint, and I wouldn't say that these are top for security, but from a lifestyle standpoint, people tend to prefer Colombia and Mexico. These are like probably the two most popular places in Latin America for somebody to go, and you can live for a fairly reasonable amount of money, and have, a pretty decent quality of life, all things considered. And again, it's always relative, but I would say those are probably the top two. Now, interestingly, none of these is like the best for tax. So for like the these are all places you can get a residence permit fairly easily, which is also, I think, fairly important. And so, yeah, those would be, for somebody who is lower income, I would consider checking them out. Other places that you might look at would be Eastern Europe, of course. So Romania, Bulgaria, Bosnia, Serbia,
Yeah.
Montenegro's
I,
got more expensive, but Albania, those places.
Yeah, and to your point, I've seen enough of your videos, and that's what resonates with me is like no one size fits all. And
Yeah,
even when you live in a particular place, I've lived in Central Asia myself. I've lived in the Middle East. I've lived in now based out of Southeast Asia. Sometimes a place seems great the first 3 months, and
yeah,
then the weather changes, and then you
yeah,
realize the day-to-day getting the Ubers or whatever the local cab sharing is a headache. Language becomes an issue. So
yeah.
what might initially seem like, oh wow, this is, I'd love to live here.
Mhm.
Come the 6 month time, it's you're not as enamored as you were perhaps when you first started out. And that's why I suppose you have so many why I left videos on your YouTube channel.
Yeah,
And one of the other things you do is talking about taxation and company formation and some of the countries to be basing your country based on tax savings. Keeping
mhm.
tax savings in mind, let's say if there's an entrepreneur, small operation, wants to set up a company with minimal tax. I know Dubai has 10% tax now, but let's say $2,000 or thereabouts is his monthly income. What would you say that, this is a place where he should think about, just as one of the places, and again, feel free to elaborate as much or as little as you think see fit.
So farming is like a completely different game, in part because of the fact that, typically speaking, there are frequently rules that will tax you based on where you live anyway. Now, this is something people get very wrong because people will believe, oh, well, you live in Canada, so therefore your company will be taxed in Canada. That's not necessarily true. I teach this thing I call the three pillars of residency, and so that's where you have to look at the residency of the company, and this meaningfully, in a lot of parts of the world, not all, but a lot, is based on management and control. So if you actually want to not pay tax in a foreign company, it means you need to have foreign management and control. That's really common. It's not everywhere in the world, but probably 80% or so of countries. Um, then there's what's called, what I would call the source or the residency of the income rules. And this is often where the work is being done. And then there's the residency of the shareholders. So all three of these things become fairly important in terms of evaluating whether you'll have a company taxed locally. I would say that in terms of ease of doing business, ease of setting up, ease of maintaining, and all that sort of thing, for most people, a US LLC is an interesting thing to consider. Not, again, there's none of these should be viewed as right for you or one size fits all or anything, but US LLC would be really common. An Estonian company could be similarly quite easy to use, quite easy to set up, maintain, etc. In some cases, this is a UK company, could be interesting. They have UK LLPs as well as LTDs, and it gets to be a little bit more of a complex conversation. Currencies that you're dealing in, do you have to concern yourself about VAT? Who are the people you have to pay? What are the currencies in terms of like currency conversion that you have to consider, something like that. So, I mean, there's a whole host of different factors to consider, and so it's, I would say, a more complex decision based on where you are. But just very loosely, there's a very good chance that if you're going to say, okay, I'm going to have a foreign company from where I'm living, because the default is always to have a company where you live. Uh, these are going to be like on some of the list of what you would consider. And there's, I don't know, 15 places in total that are probably worth thinking about, and everything else is probably redundant.
Michael, I wanted to ask you about, you have obviously lived in Malaysia. I wanted to talk specifically about a place, maybe it's under Malaysia, but slightly outside, Labuan, which
Mhm.
seems to, I've seen a bunch of videos by different YouTubers on that one. Do you want to elaborate a little bit? It's supposedly only 2 or 3% tax. And is it easy to set up in Labuan?
No. Uh, so so there are certain cases like there, so essentially if we go back a bunch, so like when I started in this business, there was much less focus on what we would call substance, right? So a lot of the laws sort of started to change sometime around 2015 or so. And so if you went back before then, you had a little bit more permissive laws, et cetera. And so, and also the things like banking, stuff like that, you could back to 12 set up a in Anguilla or Marshall Islands or something like that. You could get banking in Cayman, and off you could go, and you could operate from that fairly well if you didn't need payment processing. If you needed payment processing, you'd layer some other stuff on. Maybe you'd have like a Cyprus non-resident company, or you'd have a Gibraltar company or something like that. That started to change with the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act in 2015 and the Common Reporting Standard in 2017. It became much more difficult to bank in some of these places. And so that was just increasingly an issue. And then countries were much more concerned about this idea of, do you have substance? You had the Base Erosion Profit Shifting Action Plan that the OECD put out, and kind of this brought into these various different pillars for different countries to adopt. And when that happened, we started using Labuan quite a bit more. And the reason was, if you just sort of think about, okay, well, where can I get low tax? Where can I get banking? And where can I have low cost of labor, right? Because let's just say you're like, okay, well, I can get low cost or low tax, and I can get reasonable banking in Isle of Man. Okay, great. Well, what's the talent pool in Isle of Man? It's like non-existent, and it's super expensive. And so there's this concept of general anti-avoidance, which usually has something called the business purpose test and the economic substance test. And so you kind of wanted to design something that would have a business purpose. Like you could actually demonstrate an advantage aside from tax. And Labuan, being connected with Malaysia, happened to fit that bill. You could have, at the time, it was like it was flat $5,000 a year tax, or whichever you opted into. You could have people there like, hours a month for somebody time. It was great. And there was pretty good access to banking through Labuan. More recently, they have changed the rules a bunch such that suddenly that 3% tax rate is much more difficult to access. Well, there's a few things that happen. So first of all, there's audited financials normally in Malaysia and in Labuan. But if you did this flat tax, there was no audited financials. It was just like, just pay your tax, and that was so super easy to administer, right? Well, then they said, okay, we're going to get rid of that. Now everybody has to audit. Okay, well, now it's more complex. Then they said, okay, if you want to qualify for this 3%, you need to meet minimum substance requirements. And so you need to have 2 full-time employees, you need to have an office, you need to spend a minimum of, depending on the category of business that you're in, 50,000 Malaysian ringgit, which is not a lot. It's like about $12,500 US, but still in the country per year, and some of these things. Then they started greatly restricting the areas of business that you could qualify for. And so that became more of a problem, and banking became more of a problem. It went from, Standard Chartered and UOB and OCBC, some of the Singapore banks were really accessible, to becoming much less accessible. So it just like deteriorated as a place to get set up in. Now, doesn't mean it's not good. It can still be good for certain businesses, but you really have to pay attention to the business activities, and you have to measure it relative to other factors. The bureaucracy to set up a company in Labuan is fairly extensive, like the amount of documentation they want, et cetera. It's not as bad as Malta, which is just a complete and utter disaster, but it's fairly involved. And so the process of getting set up tends to be quite a bit slow in Hong Kong, someplace US or Estonia. And so it's just more involved. So for the right people, yeah, it can be great, but it's certainly less attractive than it was during that window as other things were closing down and it was becoming more competitive.
I genuinely appreciate going into as much detail, because off late, in I would say the last year, I've seen far too many Labuan videos. And to your point, a lot of them may be talking when maybe the data was from years ago. Do your own research, as you always say, make sure there's no one size fits all. I love that context in this one, but it made some of the YouTube made it look much more appealing than, as you mentioned now. If somebody had to set up shop in Southeast Asia with minimal taxes, and if it's not Singapore and Hong Kong, what are their choices?
In terms of where a company is located?
In terms of setting up a corporation.
So, I mean, the thing is that there's no real reason to restrict yourself to Southeast Asia, right? So Singapore and Hong Kong are perfectly business-friendly places to go, and there's lots of reason to have companies there for many people. But if you're located in Southeast Asia, like you don't have to have a company in Southeast Asia. That doesn't particularly matter. The bigger deal is like, where are your customers? what are the currencies that you're charging in? What is your payment methods, etc. And so I would kind of go back to some of the similar defaults as I was mentioning before. Like you're probably going to consider a US LLC as a possibility. Not, again, doesn't fit everybody, but often. UK LLP or UK LTD. In case of Cyprus companies might be interesting. Let's see here. Other particularly interesting options for people. I mean, again, depends on the type of industry that you're in. Like
Okay.
if you're in crypto and you don't need to worry about receiving something, then maybe a BVI company is fine for you. Most cases, it's not a very good option today. But that being said, it would be all right. Yeah, so those are just like a few sort of off the cuff considerations, but
Sure.
depends very much on your
Okay.
situation.